politics can be kind of rough and it can be kind of dispiriting a lot of the times. And I find that just falling back on what the numbers show and what the numbers can say is pretty comforting.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. Now, if you're listening to this podcast years from now, going through the list of episodes and finding one about polling and politics, then this episode is about that. It's an episode with Eric Grenier, who's a senior writer and correspondent with CBC in Ottawa. But if you're listening to this episode when it is released in March of 2020, then there is only really one answer to the question, what on earth is going on? And that is the novel coronavirus, or COVID-19, which has become a pandemic. Since the last episode that was released of this podcast and this has turned from a fascinating and somewhat disturbing news story into a world-changing and life-changing global event. Now, we're not going to talk about coronavirus on this episode. This conversation with Eric is actually from a few months ago. However, I did want to mention it at the start of this episode and say that definitely this is something we're going to have to be talking about, not just in the weeks and months ahead, but perhaps in the years and decades ahead. Now, about the conversation with Eric, we talk about how Eric started out with his website 308 before going on to the CBC, how he was self-taught as a polling analyst, and the emotional aspect of his work in voting, in terms of elections, in terms of our democracy. We talk about the perception of who is a winner and a loser, and how that perception is not new, even if it is magnified by the media. The use of data and technology by parties in different elections, targeted political advertising, the idea of making a negative choice. In other words, who do I dislike the least in an election? The power of preference and how that influences what you think and maybe pushes some of your moral or ethical beliefs to the side. Now, as usual, if you like this podcast and you like this episode, please give this show a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and you can tell me through social media what conversations you'd like to see being had on this podcast and what kind of guests you'd like to have on this show. Furthermore, at whatonearthisgoingon.ca, you can get the show notes for this episode. Finally, I really do enjoy hearing from you, and I want you to let me know what on earth you think is going on. All right, Eric Grenier, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
I'm very excited to have you. I've been following your work for some time, since before you came to the CBC, where we are right now. You had your blog 308.
Yeah.
From 2008, I think you started that?
Yep.
And it was a fascinating way to understand what was happening in Canadian politics at the time, and there was nothing else like it. Mm-hmm. I remember thinking, how do I understand what's the state of play in an election? And there was no news source, no website, but yours that was offering that perspective.
That was sort of the reason why I started it, because I'd started it after I was following the work that Nate Silver was doing at 538, which is obviously where the inspiration for the name of the website came from, during the 2008 U.S. presidential election. And I was going to that website every day. Yeah. I just loved the way that he was covering it, and just having that objective number-based focus on politics, I thought was something that it would be great if we had in Canada. We didn't, so I said, I'll just start this website and go from there. And I certainly learned a lot when I looked at some of my earlier posts back in 2008, 2009. It's a lot more amateurish than I would have been happy to realize at the time. But that was really what inspired me to start that website back then.
And it's interesting because it wasn't your background, like statistics, mathematics, probability. It wasn't necessarily your background. Mm-hmm. I mean, you came from history, and obviously you had an interest in politics. But how did you come to learn? I mean, there's not that you're a pollster, but you're a pollster and analyst.
Yeah.
How did you come to understand these skills and the jargon that's in this world?
A lot of it was self-taught. As you said, my background's not in any of those subject matter. I studied history. And I still think there's a lot to learn from history, and it's one of the reasons why I still enjoy what I do, because I try to bring in a lot of the Canadian history. I find that sometimes in Canada we forget our own history. We don't use it as an inspiration for
and we
trying
don't
to
see it as
understand.
exciting.
Yeah,
You know, it's
that was also my view. I
Yeah.
remember thinking Canadian history is boring, but now I'm reading books about like premiers in the 1920s, and I'm fascinated. So, but yeah, it was a little bit of a process of learning it as I went along. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell talked about getting your 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I actually did the math on it, and I have gotten my 10,000 hours by now. So now I feel like I actually have some claim to be a bit of an expert. But it was about reading a lot of stuff, about trying to learn and figure out what I didn't know and understand what I wasn't going to know. You know, like there's certainly going to be limits when you don't have a background in this kind of stuff. So try to be humble about what I don't know. But it was a lot of a process of just diving in, finding it interesting, and wanting to learn. And eventually, once you're in something for long enough, you start to get it, I think.
Do you find that, like, obviously at the time in 2008, you were motivated by certain curiosities, anxieties about what's happening in the world and what's happening with this election, and this missing sort of plate that we're not getting the information that we need from? Do you find that your work today is similar to that, or has it evolved to something completely different?
I think it's pretty different now. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to say it, but one of the things that probably motivated me the most at the time was that I liked charts and maps and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, I like numbers. I found, when I grew up, I loved going through hockey statistics more than, and I still do. I enjoyed looking at the standings and who's leading the scoring race, that kind of stuff, more than actually watching the games. So I think that was sort of my sort of what kept me enthusiastic about it. But now I feel like I've gotten beyond just looking at the numbers. Like I said, I try to bring in a little bit more history and have a bit of a broader view of what's going on than just what the numbers can explain. But I think that is still the basis of it. Whenever I write something, I almost always have something that is there as a proof, because it's in a number, and it's an indisputable fact that this candidate or this party is doing this well in this area, and that explains other things because then it goes from there.
You just said the title of the show without the on earth in what you just said, so you reminded me. Oh yeah, I've got to ask the first question. So Eric, and this is a broad question for a broad response. We're talking about everything in the world, but also specifically, like, what are the forces driving what's happening today? So I have to ask you, Eric, what on earth is going on?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I was like, well, instead of getting too broad about it, I'll keep it very specific to my life.
Please,
what is going on? In 2020, it's a pretty busy year. There's going to be the Conservative leadership race that's coming to a close in June. The Green Party is also going to choose a leader in October. There's a few provincial leadership races that are going to be coming to a close this year. There's the Saskatchewan provincial election in November, and there's the U.S. presidential election, of course, with the Democratic primaries, and then the election in November. And that is sort of how I think about how I structure my life, what elections and events are coming up, and what kind of year it's going to be. So for me, it's a pretty busy year. Maybe not as busy as it was last year, but so I don't know if it explains what's going on, but there's a lot going on for me.
What on earth is going on? And the answer would be a lot.
Yeah.
That's a big year. I mean, the U.S. presidential election. Will you cover that for CBC?
Yeah, a little bit. I did that back in the 2016 race, and a little bit during the midterms in 2018. I like covering U.S. elections. I find it's a bit less at stake for us as Canadians, and it's a bit easier to maybe kind of cover it as a spectator rather than having any sort of role in how voters understand it, because obviously Americans aren't going to be going to the CBC website. So it is about trying to explain what's going on there to Canadians, to a Canadian audience. American elections are just so fascinating. They're so different from ours in terms of the rules, in terms of the dynamics, the different parties, and in the primaries, I find, are just so fascinating because they're politics boiled down to its essence. It's not even about partisanship at that time, because they're all Democrats, and you have Democrats on different side of the wing, different wings of the party. And as the election unfolds, you can have people that will swing around from one candidate to another throughout the primary season. And I find leadership races in general just very interesting because of that aspect of it, where it's not about, policies that will impact people's lives. It's just about trying to convince these people who are already very political which one is the one that can win. Because in the end, that's what I think it all comes down to.
Well, and how much is a voter's choice? I mean, this is maybe a bigger question that is related to polling, but not the same thing. How much is that choice emotional and not just about reading the platform and being convinced by a good speaker, but thinking to myself, how do I feel about somebody? How do I feel about this race? And how do I feel about the winner and the loser, for example?
Yeah. I'm a big believer that that's most of it. I think that we're generally driven by a gut feeling in terms of what we think about a candidate or a party, whether we trust that not that they're going to give us this tax cut or this benefit, but do I trust them to make the decisions that I would want them to make over the next 4 years? With all of the unpredictable nature of what happens during a term of government, the platform is the platform, but it goes from, do I trust this person to make the right choices and choices that I would agree with? So I think that comes really down to it. When you're looking at the U.S. primaries, a lot of it isn't about their individual policies, though that is, splitting some of the progressive Democrats and those that are more on the moderate wing of the party. But it's, do I trust this person to beat Donald Trump? That, I think, is the primary motivation for a lot of Democratic primary voters. And that's something you just feel. There's no way to prove that. You can't lay out a policy document and be like, this is what's going to beat Donald Trump. It's just when I'm put on the same stage as the president, will people see me as, someone that can beat him, someone who's better than him?
It's almost like gambling at a roulette table. It's like it really doesn't, you have no way of knowing if it's going to be on the 17 or the 33. So you might as well just go with what you feel is good.
Yeah,
I suppose. I'm feeling the 18 black today or whatever it is. You might as well go with that because you have no way of knowing. Even though obviously when we talk about elections and politics, we do have, it's not roulette. We have a much better way of understanding what's happening. But this question of the emotion of politics and we think that we're being persuaded and we think that we're being rational, but in fact the emotion seems to be coming first a lot of the time and dragging the rest of us behind. And we then justify our behavior and our thinking and our understanding after the fact. And a lot of this has to do with polling, obviously, because we are influenced by polling and we're influenced by who we perceive to be the winner and a loser. And I think that a common thought about what polling is in the modern era, because it is a modern phenomenon, how much polling is talked about in the news. You read the paper during an election campaign, who's leading in the polls, who's behind in the polls, this person's doing better in this region, and this party has lost ground in this region. Well, that affects my understanding, not just of the horse race, but of who I might be voting for. And it affects my emotion of, well, I like this person because I like winners, or I like the underdog, or whatever. And I wonder how much your work feeds back into the actual process that it's trying to perceive. It's almost like quantum mechanics, right? Like the observer affects the outcome of what they're observing.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And the thing for me, though, is polling just a tool rather than, the thing that's causing it, right? Because in past elections, before there was, ubiquitous polling, people still had a perception of who was a loser and who was a winner, right? So this is almost just a way of just giving people that information that they might have felt, they might have thought, or they might have perceived from media coverage at the time, right? So in a way, it could be maybe just a more accurate way of kind of understanding those dynamics, rather than just following your gut, following how people are shaping the media coverage of a race. But I do think it does have an impact. But I'm not one of those people who thinks that is necessarily a bad thing. If people want to back someone who has some momentum, if people want to back an underdog, like you say, then that's their choice that they can make. If people want to make sure that they vote for one party in order to keep out another one that they dislike more, that's a legitimate choice as well, right? So it's not up to me or anybody else to say what is the right choice in terms of what is the right information that you can use to come to your choice when you make a voting decision. For me, it's information. People can use it or ignore it if they want, and that's it. It does have an influence in terms of media coverage, because the media will pay attention to parties that are seen to have more of a legitimate shot of forming government. The NDP's coverage at the beginning of the election in 2019 was a lot worse than it was near the end, because They had a bit of momentum by the end of the campaign. The Bloc Québécois was being paid more attention to at the end of that race than they were at the beginning. But I think that's only natural. You would expect the audience would probably want that. They would want to have more coverage of parties that have legitimate shots of forming government.
Yeah.
Or have a legitimate chance in the case that, as it turned out, to have influence in a minority parliament, for example.
Right. I think that's actually spot on. We've always done this. We've always looked for, who's popular, who's the winner, who seems to be doing well, who's happier, who's smiling more, who's, I mean, we subconsciously register this stuff when we're looking at a debate. Who seems more confident and happier and just more relaxed? That says a lot to me emotionally as a voter, and that's going to impact my later, maybe even if it's pseudo-rational thinking. The other thing, too, is that most people don't have time or don't want to take the time to figure the deeper parts out or to research a party's platform. And so they have to go with what information they have. And if the information is sharper, as you're doing, that may be actually better in the end than dealing with, well, how many lawn signs does the other candidate have versus the candidate that I like, which in your neighborhood, maybe the NDP has a ton of lawn signs, but the Liberals have way more in the broader context. And that may mean nothing whatsoever in the end anyways. I used to work in politics a little bit, and the conversation about are lawn signs effective or not was a really interesting one. Because when you knock on people's doors and you talk to them, the amount of times you hear someone say, it seems like the Conservatives have a lot of lawn signs out, so I think I'm going to go with them. They seem like they're going to win. You hear that all the time, and yet statistically, it doesn't seem to have the same effect as you feel that it has. And there's that whole dichotomy between feeling and rationality.
There's one. I haven't seen any deep research into it, but I know of at least one pollster who thinks that the question, not who you're going to vote for, but who do you think your neighbor is going to vote for, can actually be more accurate, and which is a fascinating idea that people are influenced by that kind of thing. There was a Quebec election a few cycles ago, 2012 or 2014, and I remember watching the debate, and François Legault, who's leader of the Coalition Avenir Québec, had a good performance in the debate. There was polling that was done after the debate, and it found that he was seen as the winner, which seemed natural when you watched it, and the coverage after it was also very positive about his performance. The poll asked, did you watch the debate? And of the people who had watched it, they thought Legault was the winner. And of the people who didn't watch it, they said, well, who won? And they said it was Legault. So they understood that even though they hadn't watched it, they understood that he was the winner of that debate because of what other people were saying about it, and that probably had an influence on them. That, oh, look, he had a good performance. That means he's not going to be a big loser in this campaign. Maybe he's someone I can back. I think that does have a big impact. And there's tons of sources of information for that. Polling is one of them. And, I would believe that it can be the most accurate source of that information rather than all of these other sources.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating. It's the idea that what we're looking at is, again, the horse race, this idea of winning and losing. It almost sometimes feels at times like a reality show. Like but we argue that, well, Donald Trump, for example, has transformed U.S. politics into a reality show. Well, wasn't it already? I mean, not to discount everything that Barack Obama did and was as president, but he was a very popular guy in 2008, and there was a sense of celebrity in that election. And there's been a sense of celebrity ever since JFK debated Richard Nixon in 1960 in the U.S. context. So we're, like you said before, this is already there. It's just becoming sharper maybe with time. But there's this sense, I think, when we talk about elections today, of how much is our feeling of what the other person doing affecting us. I remember I knocked on a door in Calgary, and the guy said to me, my neighbors, all the people in my neighborhood seem to be doing this, so I'm going to do the same thing. They're all voting Conservative, so I think that's what I'm going to do. And I remember being flabbergasted by that. What are you talking about? How is that supposed? I mean, this is coming from an idealistic view of democracy, I suppose, where we value platforms and we value policy. And what are you putting forward for your plan for the next 4 years? And what do you think? You yourself think, not what do you think other people think and do what they think. But that's unfortunately or fortunately exactly what human beings do. That's in our nature. It's in our DNA. We're eusocial animals in a way.
Well, there's a lot of emphasis put on the Thanksgiving weekend or the Easter weekend in elections. There was a lot of talk during the last campaign, and the one before it, that people's views would crystallize over the Thanksgiving weekend. And the idea behind it, although again, I'm not sure if it's actually been proven that it's an actual phenomenon or not, was that people gather around, they talk with their friends and their family, and then they kind of form a consensus opinion. And that helps, that helps them figure out what they're going to do. So again, it's just this other source of information that people are looking to their friends and their family, people that they trust. What do you think about this? Who do you think is good? That person has their own views. They're not going to be, well, I'm going to take an objective stance, Uncle, John, and I'm going to let you know exactly how, people will talk about an election that's, informed by their own views of things. And that's just a very small sample size, right? You're just talking about the people that are around your Thanksgiving table. And so how is that really all that different than looking at a poll of 1,000, 1,500 Canadians that's representative, that gives you an idea of what other people are thinking? Maybe you trust the opinion of your father more than you do strangers, but nevertheless, it's a source of information that people can choose to ignore or not.
Yeah, someone once said to me that the plural of anecdote is not data.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if you're making a decision based on Thanksgiving weekend, whether that happens or not, great. But don't think for a second that you're representing the views of everyone like your father or everyone like your family or everyone living in that region. I have constant debates with my father who lives in Alberta and who has very different political views than I do. And it's very interesting to me because when he says that everyone I talk to feels this way. Well, great. How many people have you talked to? Even if you've talked to 20 people a day for 10 years, you've contacted a fraction of this country in one specific region and probably one general social class too. Mm-hmm. And that's what polling obviously tries to get around. How do we get a representation that's proper of the country as much as possible? And to some extent it's accurate, but polling isn't always accurate. Yeah. Sometimes it doesn't predict the outcome.
No. And that's, I get the same thing on social media. Put out anything related to a poll, and people, well, no one I know is voting this way. Well, there's a reason for that. And that's, polls aren't always going to be dead on. And increasingly, I've become more used to the polls missing things. Not that they do. There's actually been studies that show that polls are about as accurate now as they ever were. So it's not true that polls are more inaccurate than they were in the past. It's just that we pay attention a lot more to the mistakes than we do when they're accurate. Because when they're accurate, it doesn't matter, right? The election's over. Now we're just talking about what happened in the election. When the polls are wrong, then it's like, well, we thought this was going to happen and it didn't, and it's these polls that were wrong. So why were the polls wrong? So it becomes a story in and of itself. Yeah. About why the polls were wrong. Yeah. But it's a legitimate concern that going into an election that the polls won't always be exactly right. And I've tried to more and more emphasize what we don't know and the possibilities that things can be wrong. Because even if they're wrong by a little bit, it can have a big impact on the outcome. As we saw in the U.S. presidential election, the polls were actually not that bad. Historically, they were within the margin of error of what they usually are. But because they were wrong in a way that helped Donald Trump win the Electoral College, it made it seem like the polls had this really bad error. But if you look at the 2016 election, the polls were about as wrong as they were in 2012. Actually, I think they were a little better than they were in 2012. But in 2012, all it did was give Barack Obama a bigger win. People were already expecting him to win. So the fact that he won by a bit of a bigger margin didn't really matter. But when it flips the other way and it can flip the winner in terms of expectations, that's when it can have a big impact. Well, and Nate Silver, who you mentioned earlier, actually wrote a post about this after the 2016 election saying, I think the title of it was, "The Polls Are All Right." Yeah. Not all correct, but they're all right. We're doing okay. It's not as bad as you think, exactly because of what you just said. Mm-hmm. And which begs another question, like, what is the utility of polling, not just in the media, not just in public consumption, but for political parties and political actors who are using this information to target their work, to try to go to different areas and regions and to understand what's working and what's not. I think you had a conversation with Bob Ray for his podcast where he talked a bit about this, but I wanted to rehash that a little bit. Like, how is this used by the actors in this scene? They use it a ton, right? And it's one of the reasons why I think it's good to have at least somewhat of a leveling of the playing field by giving the public at least some of the same information that parties are using to make their decisions. Different parties do different things. We saw in the federal election, the Liberals were doing nightly polling and quite a big sample size every night, and they were using that to understand what was going on in the race, whether their messages were appealing to people, whether they were not appealing to people, where they might need to send the leader to shore up their support. The Conservatives were also doing a lot of polling during the election. They did something a bit more targeted, whereas the Liberals were doing national kind of polling. The Conservatives were just looking at target seats and just basing their strategy and their decisions based on that polling, rather than wasting money polling areas where they know they're not going to win, or areas where they know
they're going to win.
Yeah, they're not going to spend a lot of money polling in rural Saskatchewan. And they use it a lot for understanding their messaging, what needs to change, where, again, they have to put resources in, where they send the leader. So it is a big part of elections. It's not the only one. The parties also use a lot of their own data in terms of IDing supporters and how many doors they've knocked on and what the response has been. And so when you have all those different sources of information, they can kind of inform each other, back up some of the conclusions in one, or maybe refute some of the other ones. But yeah, it's a big part of campaigning.
Another piece of that puzzle, obviously, is digital data, right? Mm-hmm. Like data mined in Facebook or Twitter or whatever, in many different ways, not just in terms of who's looking at your post and who's responding or engaging to it, but also who are they and where are they?
Yeah.
And what do they usually buy? And who do they know? Who's in their network? Is that, when we talk about traditional polling, getting a call or doing a web survey and picking who you think is the party you're going to vote for in the coming election, for example, is that traditional model being eclipsed and overwhelmed by data? And I know that's kind of asking a crystal ball question, but is that the trend that we're seeing? Because big data is becoming really the mainstay of our civilization, so to speak.
I think they're basing more on that kind of stuff than they would have in the past. I have a trouble imagining a world in the near future where it replaces polling entirely. But it is a big thing in terms of understanding their supporters. A lot of the ads that they put out during a campaign can be very specifically targeted. Targeted to specific regions, specific demographics, making sure that only people, between a certain ages who live in the GTA see this ad, and then the one that you put out in, the greater Vancouver area is very different. There's limitations to that kind of thing. In a race like the one we just saw in 2019, it was a very close race, and there was a lot of seats that were going to be decided by very thin margins. So having that kind of very targeted advertising and campaigning might have made the difference in a few seats. But if we're talking about an election like in 2015, when the Liberals had a lot of momentum and they were just gaining support in the last days, and seats that the Liberals didn't think they were going to win at the beginning of the race were suddenly in play, at that point it doesn't matter that much. When you have that kind of momentum, it can carry its way forward quite a bit. Saw that for the New Democrats in Quebec in 2011. In some of those ridings, the Bloc Québécois was spending $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. The NDP was spending $50, $60. They were literally not spending any money, and they were still able to win because it didn't really matter at that point. When there's wave elections, people will just go out and make their mind, on their own because of everything that's happening. But in very close elections, I think that's when it can really make a big difference. And like I said, in the one that we just saw, it could have been a pretty important factor. For example, when I was speaking with Dan Arnold, who was director of research, he had said how they had ads about gun control that were doing particularly well in the GTA. That's the kind of thing that might have been one of the factors that explains, not entirely, but partially, how the Liberals did well there and the Conservatives didn't. That kind of messaging that's tailored for a specific group of voters.
One aspect of this conversation so far that was really interesting is this idea that the media and media coverage has a huge influence on that which it covers. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about the future of polling, the future of statistics, and where we might be headed in our democracies in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. You mentioned earlier this concept of trust, right? Like, who do I trust will be best to lead the country in the next 4 years, for example. How much are we also talking about just mistrust? And I'm not just saying, lack of, we talk in general about democracy and the growing mistrust in the system. That's maybe another thing we can ask about. But I'm talking about how much are we making negative choices in an election? Like, I hate everybody, but I hate this person the least. Or I hate this person the most, so who's the best person to beat this person? Like you were saying about Donald Trump in the coming election. One of the main motivators for Democrats, understandably, is who can beat this guy? Who is the best capable of beating this guy? Forget everything else. How much is politics about the negative? And when we talk about polling, can we understand that through polling, or is it kind of short circuit the whole polling system?
I mean, I think it is a big factor. I think for a lot of voters, they do make that choice based on who do I dislike the least, or do I dislike this party more than I dislike this one, even though this other party is my favorite choice. Can I live with this one versus the other one? It is pretty hard to disentangle everything, and polling itself can sometimes be misleading in these kinds of questions, because when you ask people, why did you vote? People don't want to answer, and they don't want to believe themselves that it was motivated by negativity or that,
right,
or hate, or that kind of thing. It's often, parties' platform and policies. That is usually one of the top answers when people give to pollsters why they voted the way they did. But we've seen. I think there's been research on this that shows that people's views on various policies will often change based on who they like. Where if you are in the United States, for example, if you're a Republican, what the Republican candidate believes, you'll start to believe as well. So it's almost like your preference in terms of a candidate, in terms of a party, will drive your own political views rather than the opposite for a lot of people, that they will change their views to match the person that they like. We saw this with evangelicals in the United States, for example, who wanted a morally upstanding president and religious president. And when Donald Trump came in, it wasn't really that important anymore. Republicans used to be the most hawkish when it came to Russia. Now, not as much. It's they're not as concerned about Russia. So I don't think.
And free trade is another big one too.
Yeah, and I don't think their views changed. That they looked at things and decided that, oh, okay, maybe I was wrong. I think that they just changed their views because they wanted to match it up with the person that they preferred.
Which in the end changes your view. I mean, like it's amazing, because something like an evangelical's belief in who the president should be is a pretty moral issue. Or free trade or immigration. I mean, these things are pretty basic, and it's hard to imagine someone just flipping on a dime. And yet that seems to be what's happening. And maybe that's the power of leadership. Maybe that's the power of one person having the megaphone and saying, come with me. And all that, because the way the Republican Party in the United States has changed in a very short period of time, their opinions on things. I mean, this is through polling. This isn't just, Republicans believe what Donald Trump believes. Republicans now have a very different belief in free trade, immigration, moral issues than they did just 10 years ago. And it's outstanding how quick, but the same people.
Yeah.
It's not like Republicans have become a new group of people. Perhaps it's in some way that people who were once Republican but didn't vote are now voting. I mean, that may be part of it. But it's a fascinating idea of how a story and how a person can change beliefs, because maybe the beliefs aren't as grounded as we thought they were.
And part of it is, in the case of Donald Trump, is that for a lot of evangelicals, they at least, whether they agree with how the president has handled himself in his personal life or his religious views, that at least he's on their side, that he's their guy.
Right.
And whoever the Democrats will choose won't be their guy, won't be on their side. And I think that can just be, when it comes down to it, the most important thing. Do I think this person is on my side? Whether or not I agree with everything he or she believes, if I feel they're on my side, then that person is going to be the one I'm going to vote for.
Well, and not to get too into the weeds on this, but one thing that Donald Trump has done to solidify his base is promise and then deliver on Supreme Court justices. Because for many Americans, that's the number one issue.
Yeah.
I want a Supreme Court that will overturn Roe v. Wade. That for them, for many people, that's the biggest thing. And if you deliver for me that, I don't care if you're corrupt. I don't care if you're, best friends with Vladimir Putin. It doesn't matter. That is my big moral issue, and the rest of the world can go to hell.
And in a way, it's not it's a rational kind of feeling when you think about a rational choice. When you think about the U.S. system, that a Supreme Court judge will be there for a long time
Yeah.
and probably have a bigger impact on American society than a president who's there for 4 to 8 years, right? So if you're coming down to prioritizing what is most important, it's not irrational to prioritize. I want someone who I know will choose good Supreme Court judges over the other person.
I find it like you're in a privileged position to be able to look at all this data and statistics and information and say, well, wait a minute, this is the story you think that is happening, but here's the story that's actually playing out. And I think when we talk about politics, we can't disentangle it completely from story and the narrative of what's happening. I mean, there was a narrative in the 2015 campaign, like you talked about, this change election, this wave election. And there was a narrative in 2019 of, a referendum, so to speak, on Justin Trudeau, which is why the scandals like blackface, brownface, or whatever, I think were magnified, because that was the theme of the campaign. Obviously, we talk about ballot questions a lot, and the Conservatives' ballot question was, is Justin Trudeau a phony? Mm-hmm. And most people would say, yeah, I guess so. He's kind of a phony, so maybe you should be prime minister. But the Liberals' ballot question is, well, are we doing enough? Because if we're doing enough, we're going to keep going, and that not most people, but enough people were able to say that, yes, they were, for them to win the election. But we're talking still about story and this emotional, grounded sense of story. And like I said, you seem to be in a position where you can not just correct the story, but say, wait a minute, the story you think you're telling is not necessarily what's happening. And are there moments, whether it's in a campaign or outside of an election, where you're able to say to even your colleagues here at CBC, hang on a second, the numbers are saying something different from what you think is happening?
Yeah, and that's actually one of my favorite things to do, not to be a contrarian, but just to look at a story and be like, well, this is the conventional wisdom, and this is what everyone seems to think is going on. Is this true? Sometimes I look into it and I'm like, oh, it is. And sometimes I'll write that up because I think even that is interesting when you can prove something that people just kind of believe, and if you can kind of back it up and say there's actual good reason for this. But yeah, there's also lots of times when it doesn't quite line up with the proof, with the evidence. And I think that's what is so interesting about the role I have, is that it tends to be far more focused on what can be shown, what is provable with the information that we have, because a lot of kind of political commentary is based on kind of gut feeling, anecdote. I talked to some people on the ground here. That can have really good value as well. But it's good to have also another angle that comes at it from, well, what can we prove? What can we show is actually going on, and that we understand why it's happening.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of the work that I do. I can't at the moment think of a particular example of when I was able to do that recently, but I find that's what I get motivated by is the ability to try to take a step back and take as much of an objective view as I can, using the information that is available to prove or disprove something. Because politics can be kind of rough and it can be kind of dispiriting a lot of the times, and I find that just falling back on what the numbers show and what the numbers can say is pretty comforting for me, at least.
Do the numbers ever surprise you?
Oh yeah. No, I mean, there's been tons. Like, for example, one of the ones that I can think of that I was like, I'm going to see if this is actually true. During the last Ontario provincial election, and then afterwards for the federal election, a lot of discussion about how Ontarians like to have one government in Toronto and then a different party in government in Ottawa. And it's something that's talked about as if it's like a truth in Canadian politics, that you want to have different governments in one capital or the other. So I looked into it and I tallied it up, and it was actually true. It was a huge proportion of the time. It was something like 75-85% of the time, the party in power in one capital didn't win the election in the other one. I thought it was going to be a bit less clear than that. I thought it would be that people would just remember, well, during the time when the Ontario PCs were in power for decades at a time. It was also when the Liberals were in power under Trudeau and Pearson and Saint Laurent and all this, and so they were in power for a long time. And so it doesn't actually mean anything. But then you could actually look at it, it still, that cycle kept on going into the 90s, into the 2000s.
Interesting.
And I mean, it's impossible to know why. It could just be that, there's natural cycles in politics, and for one reason or another, Ontario's is not lining up with the federal one.
Right.
And so it just kind of happens naturally that when one government gets old and tired, it's replaced by another party, and that for one reason or the other, the different levels of government are just misaligned in terms of the timing. But it could also be that voters actually not consciously think about it, but the way that one government is operating in one capital affects their views of the politics in the other one.
Well, it's hard for a lot of people to separate, provincial from federal politics. They hear on the radio, watch on TV. If they see the news once a week, Liberals, Conservatives, and it's one block for them. And, when I worked in politics, that was a theme. Like, people don't know. Like, a lot of people do, but a lot of people just don't separate it in their minds. They conceptually understand that there's obviously a difference between municipal, provincial, and federal, but they're not following it, so to speak. And so is it Liberal, is it Conservative, is it NDP, whatever? And I think that, because obviously the provincial and federal election aren't going to happen on the same day. Oh, the Liberals are in power. Oh, they're kick the bums out. Oh, the Conservatives are in power, kick the bums out. Going back and forth, back and forth. That's obviously not an explanation, but it's an interesting insight into how people might actually behave.
Yeah, and if they don't, necessarily think about how the parties are split, and, the Conservatives and the Ontario PCs are completely independent entities. They're not affiliated in any way.
Yeah.
A lot of voters will still think of them as the same group of people, that they back each other, and they do, right? It's for the most part, a lot of the volunteers, a lot of the donors are the same people at both levels. And during the 2019 federal election campaign, it was a problem for the Conservatives that Doug Ford was unpopular, and it was hurting them because a lot of people would say to the Conservative candidate going to the door, that they had a lot of big problems with the Ford government. And the Liberals understood this, and they understood that for a lot of voters, if you were trying to make the pitch that Conservatives cut, and the proof is Doug Ford, a lot of people would not be like, well, it's a different level of government. No, and they're a different party. They'd be like, yeah, that's true. Yeah, okay. That's how, and it's a natural way to think about it.
For sure.
Now we have a lot more divisions between the parties, at least officially. But, throughout Canadian history, it is, Liberals at one level of government tend to be the same group of people at different levels of government. And there's lots of links between them. And it's not unnatural for voters to connect the two.
It's fascinating, though. Like, if we take a step back from that and say, 2019 federal election, October, about what was it, a year and a half earlier, Doug Ford was elected for a completely different party. And then was a liability for that party, for the federal version of that party a year and a half later. It's fascinating because he was, in the narrative of elections, he was the most popular guy. Mm-hmm. Just a year. How does a year and a half change that? Well, we know that he was not the most popular guy when he was elected. He never was the most popular guy. That wasn't the narrative. But the narrative in each election changes, which is so interesting to me because they take on lives of their own. It's really not like polling, because in the context of Canadian history since 1867, we could say, well, here are all the elections that have occurred, as if they're snapshots in time. Mm-hmm. This is a snapshot of 1898. This is a snapshot of 1935. Well, elections don't work that way. Elections are contained events in and of themselves. It's almost like, we have all of this story here, but here is where we did a mini-series. And in this miniseries, we had totally different plot points and a totally different perspective of what was happening. And people's understanding of the horse race and of the story at the time changes in those contexts, and which makes sense why a year and a half after an election, which was supposed to be in a way decisive in our democracy, people's understanding has completely shifted, or may have shifted.
It's always within the context of each individual election, because I had written something about this earlier in 2019, I think, that when you looked at Doug Ford's election victory in 2018, he had about as many votes in Ontario as Stephen Harper did in Ontario in 2015. The difference was that fewer people voted in the provincial election. The votes were split in a different way between the Liberals and the NDP. So the amount of votes that weren't good enough for Stephen Harper in 2015 was good enough for Doug Ford in 2018. And so the argument was that if the kind of turnout that we see in federal elections continues, that Andrew Scheer couldn't replicate Doug Ford's electoral map unless he was gaining more supporters or the Liberals fell back quite a bit. So it does show how you do need to understand how each individual election is very different. There was this narrative that the Conservatives were in general on the upswing. They won an election in New Brunswick. They won in Prince Edward Island. The CAQ won in Quebec. You had Doug Ford in Ontario, Jason Kenney in Alberta. But if you looked at it in a little bit more detailed way, Jason Kenney took about as much of the vote as the combined scores of the Wildrose and PCs did in 2015, which was an election that the NDP won. The PCs in New Brunswick, they lost the popular vote. They actually dropped support, but because of the way the map worked, they won more seats and formed a minority government. In PI, it was the same kind of thing. They more or less took the same amount of support in the 2019 election that they did in the 2015 one that they lost. So it does, you do need to take into account the other factors, the other sort of unique natures of each election rather than making it into this broad narrative, because it sometimes seems like an easy way to explain how politics are unfolding, but it's usually a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, as usual, it's more nuanced. What is the future of polling?
A lot has changed over the last decade or so. The basic concepts are still the same, that you're asking people questions, you're trying to build a representative sample of them and drawing conclusions from that. So that aspect is not changing. There are some people who are trying different ways of monitoring social media, so without directly asking people questions, but kind of deriving answers to questions based on what people are saying and their behavior on social media. I think there's still quite some, ways to go on that kind of thing before we can really take for granted that you can understand what people are saying just by modeling the conversation and trying to derive answers from it without asking them questions directly. But from like the technical side, 15, 20 years ago, all polls were done by telephone. And everybody picked up the phone. It was natural for people to do that. When we were young, the phone would ring. You didn't know who it was. It was exciting. Who's this person that's calling? Maybe it's my friend. Now it's not like that. You have the caller ID, cell phones. Most people will not pick them up,
even if they know who's calling. Yeah,
And but just in general, we get bombarded with so much spam that people's natural kind of inclination is not to pick up the phone. Who is this person bothering me?
It's my mother. I'm definitely not answering it. Yeah.
So a lot of pollsters have moved online, and that has happened over the last 10 years. So a lot of the polling is now done online, which has its own challenges, but is probably more and more what we're going to be seeing, that pollsters who are still doing their polling over the phone will probably join their samples. We're seeing that quite a bit now, where people will have a bulk of their poll done online and then a portion of it by phone to sort of act as a guidepost, just to make sure that the online sample is well calibrated. And I think that's maybe where things are moving forward, in that it'll be more of this kind of polling that's done online. But how people are going to contact people, maybe that's something that's going to change. With social media, will there be more sampling from that, getting people to come to take a poll in that way, rather than having a pre-existing panel that you invite people to take part in a survey. But the basic concepts of it aren't going to change, and I think there's still a lot of value in just asking people what they think.
There's a question that's somewhat connected to that, which I want to round us off with, which is about polarization. It's a big theme in the world right now, not just partisanship, but the sense that we're going into our groups and we're becoming entrenched in them, and part of our definition as a group is hating the other side and thinking that everything that they do is wrong, and whatever we can do to prevent them from being in power, which is in a way anathema to what a democracy is. Democracy should, making a bit of a value statement, should be where I accept when the other guy is in charge for a while, because he's going to respect certain rules and certain lines, right? And now we live in a world where no one respects it. We believe that no one's respecting the lines, and so don't let them be in power. Polarization is a theme not only in the world and in the news, but on this podcast. It's talked about a lot. A lot of my guests bring it up, and I bring it up a lot. Are we seeing this actually happening in the numbers? Because if we're talking about polarization, we're talking about who do you identify with politically? Who's your political group? Who are you going to vote for? And are you going to vote for the same thing over and over and over again because that's your group? Is this reflected in the numbers, or is it a little bit more uncertain?
I think Canada is not heading in exactly the same direction as the United States. In the United States, being a Democrat, being a Republican is part of your identification.
It's like
part
cultural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, there's been polls asking, like, how would you feel if your son or daughter were going to marry someone from another party? A lot of Americans have a big problem with that. And that kind of polarization in the United States is pretty dramatic. It's influenced by a lot of factors, including, just geography, that people are sorting themselves out into different communities where, Hillary Clinton in the last election would get 90% of the vote, and then in other areas she'd get 10. And we don't really see that here in Canada. There's a couple parts of the country where one party is very popular, but in general we don't have that sort of stark polarization. There are still a lot of Conservatives living in downtown Toronto. There are still people who vote Liberal and NDP in rural Saskatchewan. And we don't see as much party identification. In the past, it's a question that pollsters have asked often: which party do you identify with? The number of people who will say they identify as a Liberal, identify as a Conservative, is lower than it used to be. I think people are a little bit more willing to move around, and we've seen this in a number of elections recently, where parties that in the past hadn't had a lot of success suddenly forming government, suddenly making big inroads. We can just look at the last couple of elections. You had the Liberals drop down to 19% 2011. They jumped up to 40% in 2015, back down again. The NDP is going up and down. The Bloc goes from, an afterthought to being again a significant player. So I don't think we have that level of polarization. I think in the conversation, maybe that we're a bit more polarized than we used to be, and I think social media has a big impact on that in a negative way. But I've been reading a lot of history lately. Turn of the century politics. It was pretty bad back then. They were rough. Not only were you my opponent, you were also probably a traitor and a thief and a drunk and all these kinds of things. People were suing everybody left and right, which we don't see now. So politics, I think, has always been pretty rough. I think what might be different now is that we're kind of exposed to it every single waking moment of our lives. If you're on social media, if you're the 24-hour news networks, it's hard to get away from it. So it feels like we're just constantly being bombarded by this very negative politics. And I think in the past you had a better way to avoid it if you wanted to.
It's interesting because we're being told that it's polarized, it therefore becomes polarized, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, in part, that we read in the media all the time, that these camps are being formed and entrenched and whatever, and that becomes true because then I have to ask myself as the reader, well, what camp am I in? Mm-hmm. And obviously it's influenced a lot by American politics, but it's interesting because it's been said, I think this was in the New York Times or The Economist or something, where it said that the true aberration in American politics was bipartisanship. Right. Between the post-World War II era until about 10, 15 years ago, when the two parties agreed on a whole lot of things. And no matter which party was in power, they were going to enact this central area. And then the difference was maybe in abortion or in some social policies or the rate of taxation. But in general, we all agree that there are taxes. We all agree that it's in kind of this range. We all agree that we're going to let the economy be a little bit less regulated than before. But there was this kind of consensus, which is now broken. But that period was the aberration, because for most of American history, it's as you describe it, the turn of the century, where it was the other guy's a liar and a thief and a criminal. Yeah. And if there's a return to that, I think it's a bit because we're told there's supposed to be, that this is happening in the media. And in a way, that's where the numbers can come in and say, hold on, that's that moment that you can be the contrarian and say, wait a second, the numbers don't necessarily support this. And I've heard from some people who look at the numbers who say that it's not as bad. Mm-hmm. It's not as bad as it is historically, but it's not as bad as it's being described. And so it might be this problem with social media where we're being amped up into believing that something's happening that's not.
Yeah, and I mean, most people go through their days, they don't think about these things as much as people who, like me, are paid to think about it every single day.
Right.
And I think that's one thing that is a challenge, is that for a lot of journalists, for example, we're surrounded by people who also focus entirely on politics. We're on Twitter, which is really a place that is just very political, very unrepresentative of the population. And I think we have to guard ourselves against feeling that the way that this person who's probably a bot feels about this issue is how, the country as a whole. Most people are going about their regular days and don't think that this guy or that leader is a traitor, and I think there's a lot more. I think maybe I'm being naive, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think for the most part people are generally kinder people than maybe they seem to be.
I agree. Yeah, Eric. Last question: is there one thing that we haven't talked about in this conversation that you wish we had? That if we had another hour to dig into it, you'd really want to go there.
You know what? I think we covered a lot.
This is where you can say the one thing that you're glad we didn't talk about, but if we could talk about.
Well, I always love talking about history, so we could have talked about the election in 1926. That would have been an interesting one.
What is it about history that inspires you? Because I don't think it's too conceited to say that I'm a history buff. I really like history, but what is it about history that inspires you?
I think it's because, there's a couple of lessons from it, I think. Everything that's happening, there's always something that's happened similar to it in the past, and there's something to learn about it. And history gives us a lot of an explanation of what's happening now. I find that if you understand history, you can explain a lot of what's going on in the world. I find it's just the most fascinating story because no matter how deep you go, there's always a bit more deeper you can go. You read a textbook in high school, it seems like that covers everything. But then you realize there's entire books about this one paragraph that was in this textbook. Right. And I just find it's just so interesting to hear these stories, these real stories, which are often just as interesting as anything anybody can make up. And one of the things that I try to tell myself to keep myself enthusiastic and motivated about my work is that, it's a saying that people have said in before, that journalism is the first draft of history. I like the idea of chronicling what's going on from a view of 50 years from now, people are going to be thinking about what's happening today and how we understood it. And, we get a first crack at it. And I think that's really interesting.
Not to be chronocentric, to privilege our own time, but a lot of people say that we're living in an unprecedented time where there is no analog in the past to what's happening now, this radical transformation. Things are getting faster and faster. Social media, the internet, there is really no comparison. But do you agree with that? Or are there things in the past we can look to, not to explain what's happening, but to give us some perspective?
Well, in terms of, the role that technology is having on our lives, I think that obviously that's unprecedented, right? The speed at which things happen now. But it's all relative because things are already happening pretty quickly in the 90s, right? And now they seem to be going even quicker. So, when you think about when, there would have been wireless transmissions when they first emerged, when daily newspapers would have emerged. I remember reading an article, it was written maybe 100 years ago or so. We were saying, and the author was concerned about how fast life was getting, and that people were going to get exhausted by all of this information and everything. So in that sense, some things don't change, and the thing that doesn't change, the most is that things change, and that we continually keep evolving, we continually keep developing as a society, and there's always going to be a big chunk of people that are not happy about that, and it doesn't matter how far back you go. There's always some people who are pushing against change. But they'll fail. We can't stop that. But in terms of trying to understand the world that we're in now, if we are in a world that is very kind of full of tumult and change, and there's tons of times you can look back to when the world seemed to be getting a little bit unhinged. After the First World War, when politics was just in complete transition here in Canada and in the rest of the world as well, as people's old views of how things were completely changed, they started thinking, well, maybe we don't need to vote the same way that we did before. Maybe we need entirely new policies on how to run the country. So I think that, the specifics will always be a bit different, but some of the broad trends don't really change all that much.
So now I have one last question. I promise this is the last one. And I ask it because you actually just brought it up. It's this idea of having too much information. And, if 100 years ago someone was saying, there's just too much, there's definitely too much now. It feels like it's overwhelming. And coming from a perspective where you're dealing with and being a merchant of information in a way, do you feel that, like, that there's just so much that we become not only exhausted but indifferent to it. And specifically when it comes to polling, because there's so many different polls I can choose from, whether it's in the American or the Canadian context. It's like, I don't even care. Is there a certain exhaustion or apathy as a result of the abundance of information in the information age? Is that happening?
I think that for a lot of people, it makes it harder to follow what's going on and makes them want to have someone explain it to them. Like that's why I think that daily podcasts, for example, people want to be, well, what's the most important thing that I needed to know from yesterday?
Right.
And, in the work that I do, trying to just pull together all of the polling data that's out there is to try to just boil it down for people to explain to them what's the broader picture that's going on. I think that is something that maybe is a bit different, but, in a way, we're in a terrible age where things are awful in terms of, the information that's out there, the fake information, and how, there's a lot of bad actors out there. But in another way, we're in like this golden age where if you want something, if you want to learn about something, you can right away. Like when we were young, if you didn't know something, you didn't have a way to find it out right away. You had to go to the library, you had to go to an encyclopedia. You couldn't just look it up. Now it's, if you want, you don't need to be ignorant about a subject for more than a few seconds. And that's kind of incredible.
Yeah, that's a good way to end us, actually. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
To learn more about Eric Grenier, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and also you can go to the show notes. So find the things that were referenced in this conversation you might not know about, and get a link to learn more. Now, your quote of the week is by someone who actually had a big influence on Eric Grenier in his early days with 308. He had a different website called 538 about American elections. He wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise in 2012, and his name is Nate Silver. This is his quote from that book. One of the pervasive risks that we face in the information age is that even if the amount of knowledge in the world is increasing, the gap between what we know and what we think we know may be widening. Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks to CBC Ottawa for giving us the use of their podcast studio to record this conversation. Next week, I'm talking with Queen's Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, Christine Overall. I'll see you then.